you know about the USA? Do you know about the government? Can you tell me about the Constitution? Hey, learn about the USA. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers did agree to write a list of principles for keeping people free. The USA was just starting out, a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out, the things that we should be. And they put those principles down on paper and called it the Constitution. And it's been helping us run our country ever since then. The first part of the Constitution is called the Preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers all sat down and wrote a list of principles that's known the world around. The USA was just starting out, a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out. They wanted a land of liberty, and the preamble goes like this. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, for the United States of America.
Of Mr. Neach isn't prepared all the way, or Professor Neach. Let us start off this video by saying welcome. I hope you guys are enjoying class so far and the things that we've gotten to do. It's been a pretty busy first 2 weeks, and the first few videos were about 42 minutes long or something like that, and now this one is going to be significantly longer, so buckle in. It is going to be a lot for us to go over. I mean, we're talking a lot about the Constitution, the lead up to the Constitution, the building blocks of it. I'm going to be going over a good portion of the entire Constitution and really laying out the different parts of it that make it so unique and why it was so important, not only back then, but now as well. We are going to be talking a lot about the structure of certain aspects of the government. There isn't going to be a whole lot that we go into in certain parts. The three that I'm not going to go into as much are the judiciary, congressional stuff, and the executive branch. And the reason is because we're going to go over in more detail those weeks exactly what the structure and layout is for those particular branches in the Constitution. And that way we can kind of at least get through most of it. I'll go over very basic stuff. For the most part, we're going to be going over those in more detail the weeks that we talk about the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branch. I know that this is going to be a while, so if you guys could keep track of where you leave off in the video, because I know hopefully you don't sit through the entire hour plus video that this is going to be without a break. So I hope that you guys can at least get through half of it and then do the rest of it later on, because it's just going to be a lot to take in all at once. This might be one that you need to watch multiple times for different reasons, if you're just studying, but also just to retain all the information and everything that I say. So this week we are talking about the Constitution and the Republic and the actual building blocks of the Republic. And the beginning video that I showed was actually from a cartoon called Schoolhouse Rock, which was very famous in the 1970s, going into the 80s, and even still now is used in a lot of educational purposes. This is obviously a kid's cartoon teaching kids about the Constitution. It's kind of a catchy little song. I've always seemed to like it, and it helps me remember at least the first couple portions of the preamble. It really does lay out a lot about what our founding fathers thought this Constitution was supposed to represent. The Constitution, and many founding fathers felt this way, was a lot of compromise in that it was not perfect, and it still has flaws and pitfalls, but founding fathers did the best that they could, and they came to a couple of intersections where they really didn't know where to go with some of the Constitution, and this was the first time this had ever been attempted, a democracy of this size and a balance between different powers that they felt could last many, many years. And so far it has, and hopefully it stays that way. Right now are at a point where our Constitution is really being challenged, but this is not uncommon. Since the founding of our Constitution, it's really gone through its challenges. It's gone through a lot more than what we even expect now. And reading a lot about it in those first couple of years too, were very trying, because they did not know if this thing was going to work. And a lot of the founding fathers thought this is going to be flawed and there's no way. This thing is so fragile, we have to keep it intact. And it is very fragile, but it's also very strong in certain aspects. And talking about the different branches of government and how this was laid out, I hope this gives you guys more perspective about what exactly the thought process was going into making this government system that we have, this constitutional republic we have. So what is a republic? A republic is defined as a form of government in which power resides in an electorate that is exercised by elected representatives who are responsible to the people. So this is not a direct democracy like we talked about last week with the Athenian democracy. This is not anything that really we get to vote on anything except for certain aspects of who we want to represent in our federal government. In our state government, in our local stuff, we get to vote on certain laws. California law is that way. In some states, that's not always the case. Citizens don't get to vote directly on certain laws. So California has kind of like this hybrid constitutional republic, which our republic looks very similar to the way the United States is also laid out. But we can also directly vote on certain bills that are brought to that we want to question. This weird balance that we have where we in California can vote in a direct democracy in our own state, but our federal government is strictly a representative democracy, and we cannot vote on certain bills and laws that come into practice that we might want to vote against. Again, we are not a pure democracy, meaning that we have representatives who represent us, and that is a form of democracy, but that's not the purest form of democracy. And that's okay, because pure democracy can really be challenging. It's almost impossible to keep in order. That's the big distinction that we wanted to make when we made this government, was making sure that there was a way to control people but still give those same democratic principles and protect those democratic principles. This really wasn't thought of as a viable government source until the American and French Revolution, and they both took very separate paths. America ended up with this form of republic that we have still to this day, and the French have gone through at least 8 different republics, and I can't remember what republic they're on now, but they also have gone through monarchies. They've gone through dictators. Napoleon is a great example of that. The Nazis came through and took over France for a little bit, so the French Republic has really had its ups and downs, and that's for a variety of reasons like we talked about last week. They were much more violent than the American Revolution, and it was more anarchical than the American Revolution was. I mean, the French Revolution makes the American Revolution looked tame. After that, the same democratic principles were still a general idea in France, and eventually they got rid of Napoleon and of the Nazis and tried to make a government like they had before. The goals of a democracy were to eventually replace monarchies, and that's what they ended up doing for the most part. There's still some monarchies in place, but they have very democratic systems, and there's very few pure monarchies anymore. And I can't even name one that I really think is a pure monarchy without a government structure below it. Maybe Jordan, I think, is the only one, the country of Jordan. That's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head that has an actual king who has legitimate powers. The establishment of liberal democracies really took even past World War II. I mean, it took almost 150 years to really establish these forms of government. And even then, still to this day, like it's not always the easiest thing to put into place. We tried in different areas and it's only stuck in certain places, and in other places it's completely fallen apart or people just abjectly hate it. So liberal democracies are not easy to, one, put in, and then on top of that, have them be structurally sound and people accept them. Some forms of liberal democracy that are really important if you want to find a viable one, there are a couple concepts that you need to have. And basically there are three of them. One is a living constitution. And that means that the constitution can be changed. It's not set in stone, that it's able to be replaced. It's malleable, that people aren't set with the only way that they can have a government, that they can make changes if they need to. The second one is a rule of law. And rule of law is really important because that means that nobody is above the law than anybody else. It doesn't matter what level of government that they're on, that there's a rule of law and they need to follow that law. And there's ways to also make sure that that person can be replaced if laws are broken. The last one is also the character of the Constitution. And that means that the Constitution itself establishes certain principles that are really what we find to be in most liberal democracies: freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom to allow people to live a happy and prosperous life, and also be working towards the betterment of everybody. If a constitution just kind of lays out the government and doesn't lay out its principles, then it's not really a full constitution. And we've seen some constitutions like that before. Russia, for example, has a constitution, but their constitution is very general and does not talk about specific rights for individuals. So the constitution, when you look at it, it's not really as liberal as it would sound, even though it is a quote-unquote constitution. In order for a republic to really be able to function, it has to have workable democracy. And there are 5 different environments that be required for a democracy to really work. First is an educated public, and that's especially important. That was an important role for Jefferson. Jefferson felt that the public needed to be educated, and he said the biggest threat to a democracy was an uneducated public. And that's due to the fact that the public is the one that holds the leaders accountable, that they are the ones who vote them in, that they are the ones who listen to the laws. And if people can't read or understand how those laws work, then they aren't going to be able to keep track or to really hold accountable the people that they put into power. And if you don't have an educated public, then that really means that your republic itself, your actual government, is going to be threatened. The second one is a responsible public, meaning that people don't have mob rule, that people feel that they're voting on principles. That can mean many different things when you say responsible public. But basically saying that people vote responsibly, that they care about their government. If they don't care about their government or take care of it, then it can really go to the wayside. The third is economic stability, and this is really important for almost every government. If a government, no matter what it is, isn't economically stable, it's really not going to work or function correctly. But especially for democracies. Democracies are all based off of liberal world order and freedom of trade and things like that, within some exceptions, but almost all of them accept this idea of free trade. That economic stability, if it's threatened, can really threaten the stability of the entire government. If people aren't getting fed or don't have jobs, they're not going to want the government that they have in place. So having a workable democracy, if you don't have those necessary things, it starts to crumble a little bit. The fourth is social cohesion. And this is another one that's, when you really look through all of them, it's kind of questionable whether we have some of these right now. But social cohesion really means an identity that people define themselves as. And really, we do sort of have that, where we kind of define ourselves by baseline of being an American, but people are now defining that really differently. We've always had really a lack of social cohesion, even since the founding of our country and all the way through the Civil War, the very founding of our country. There was major issues all the way through World War II. There's very few instances where we actually all have a social cohesion that we need to do something. Having that social cohesion where there's stability amongst race relations, the religious relations. If you don't have that social stability, then you really aren't not going to have a functioning government, because people are going to question everything around them. The last one is consensus. That, again, means that we are all functioning as a society, and that certain things that we might disagree on, but we agree on how to go about certain principles, or agree that something needs to be done about certain things. And that consensus is really hard to come up with. When how many times do we talk about bipartisanship that doesn't happen? A consensus is almost impossible to achieve when you don't have all these other things. So if we really don't have an educated public, or we're losing our educated public, we don't have a responsible public as well who's really questioning the power that we as a society have. The last one, we don't really have economic stability. We have some of it, but there's sometimes where that could be fluctuating back and forth. It was only 10 years ago that we had a major recession. Or the second to last is social cohesion, where we really don't really have much of that, where there's not much cohesion between the different parts of our society that are very vastly different and have very different opinions about the world today. And the last one is consensus. And again, I can't really say if we have that. This really does make you question, is it fixable? So to start with the next part of this lecture, we're going to start talking about the Articles of Confederation. I brought them up a couple of times, but this is really important to go over, and I like going over just the structure of these so you guys can see why it was really poorly thought out. It was not very well thought out. It was really kind of hard to manage this form of government. It really shows why it's important that we have some sort of power to our federal government. And if we start taking those away, things can go wrong. But again, there is that balance between too much government and not enough. We're going to show, at least with the Articles of Confederation, what happens if you don't have a strong central government and the things that can go wrong. The Articles of Confederation were the very first government that we put into place when we wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And that was written by John Dickinson, and it was ratified in 1781. So it almost took 5 years to ratify this thing through different states, which in and of itself was kind of a sign that there was not much consensus or cohesion amongst the states to really come up with a strong federal government, or even a government that had some sort of power. It was a loose union between the states, because we have to remember at this point, the colonies and the states really consider themselves individual countries. People would define themselves as, I'm a Massachusetts man, or I'm a New Yorker, or I'm a Virginian. And these things would really be important to identifying who that person was. These states were all individual countries. They were not states that they all looked at each other. They were not the United States. And that took many years for them to really have that defined definition of what it meant to be an American. That was sort of came out of nowhere as well, trying to create this social cohesion. That was really hard to find. When they created the Articles of Confederation, sovereignty of the states was the primary importance. They did not want a strong federal government, since they had just gotten out of one that was really powerful, and they didn't want to subject themselves to that same sort of thing. There was an absolute fear of monarchy. There was plenty of people who were called monarchists, and we'll talk about Hamilton in a second, speaking of which I have the shirt right now. Hamilton was considered to be a monarchist, and we'll talk about what that means. And why he was kind of considered that. The structure of the Articles of Confederation really made sure that the federal government at that point had almost no power, and made it almost impossible to try and draft laws that would supersede the sovereignty of the states. So it was a unicameral legislature, meaning that the legislature, or the Congress that they had, was one body. So like we have now, where it's the House and the Senate, it's supposed to balance out each other in case there is no one superseding party or overruling. That was a byproduct of kind of our own, like what we saw with the unicameral legislation, which just having a unicameral legislature really meant that there was just one governing body either could overstep their power or really not be able to use it at all. There was no executive or judicial branch, meaning that there was no form of presidency, and there was no judiciary too. So there was no federal judges. All the judges had to be state-run, and there was no president. They were so fearful of monarchy, they didn't want to put somebody like that in power. There were some things that we ended up taking from Articles of Confederation that were really important to the Founding Fathers, especially when it came to sovereignty of the states. And the second article in the Articles of Confederation stated that sovereignty declared expressly delegated powers, and eventually it became the 10th Amendment, that giving the states the powers to have their own laws. That's why, for example, marijuana law, it's legal in California, but not legal in federal law. And we'll talk about that when we talk about federalism in a couple of weeks. And it's really important that the 10th Amendment came into power, because that's really given a lot of sovereignty to the states to make their own laws. But, there's certain things that you can and can't do that are considered federal crimes as well. The third article stated that it was supposed to promote the general welfare, and this was the British model that was carried over to the Constitution as well. Like we talked about when they sang in the preamble, the general welfare of the people was extremely important, that having a government to make sure that it protected the general welfare of the overall population was a central aspect of these types of governments that they wanted to create. Each state got one vote. So that meant there was 2 to 7 representatives from each state. You know, if Virginia was bigger or had more people than Connecticut, they still had the same amount of votes. And that was a way to make sure that smaller states still had some sort of form of representation. Population-wise, that meant Rhode Island had a lot of power. They were the tiny state, and they were really the most rebellious out of everybody at this point. They put a lot of restrictions on what Congress could not do. And the first thing that they really said was Congress can't tax anybody. Again, coming off of time for we just revolted in the Revolutionary War over the fact that they had to pay taxes. People did not want to pay tax to a high federal government. And if they had to pay taxes, again, we're founded on the fact that we hate paying taxes. And people back then especially did not want to pay taxes to a large federal government that they had just left. Congress had to make formal requests to states to raise troops or funds to the Treasury. This was more like it's a loose confederation of states. It was like some sort of charity almost. The best way I can describe it, that they were like, hey, we need help raising an army, and they had to go to different states to do that, to get funds. And many in the southern states didn't want to contribute to the federal government for different various reasons. The northern states were the ones getting hit hardest by the revolution. So they went to Congress the most often to ask for funds, ask for help to look for refugees during war and things like that, to take care of them. And this became a problem during the Revolution because Washington and Hamilton, who was his right-hand man to that point, could not feed their soldiers. They could not clothe them properly. They could not give them weapons. And if you can't afford to buy, make, or weapons, and then not only that, but not feed your troops, you're not going to win a war. The powers that Congress did have at that point were they could appropriate and borrow money from different states. They could handle foreign relations, but even those were limited on what they can do. A lot of this came from the issue that each individual state saw itself as a nation. So if they had somebody from New York who was going off saying one thing to somebody from another country, that they took that at face value, that the other states believed that. But the other states, if we had somebody from Virginia who believed a completely different thing from the guy from New York, that can really create a lot of issues with an overall policy that the country has. So you need one central government to have a say in what the entire population thinks. That's why it's so important now that you have one person saying what that country believes instead of all these individual governors. Let's say you had a governor from each state who was saying something different. That can be really difficult to kind of form one cohesive policy. So why the Confederation? We've already talked about how there was a strong distrust of the executive, so they really did not want executive powers. They wanted a congressional form of government. States had already Republican governments. Another was not deemed necessary. So they had their own forms of Republican governments where they voted people in for governor and things like that. It wasn't deemed necessary to have something that superseded those state governments. We've already talked about how states viewed themselves as each individual country, not as one nation. And that was really hard to have and convince people that you needed to have a strong government above them because they believed so firmly in the nation that they created. A lot of what this is like the European Union now. The European Union is a good example of kind of a confederation of states that come together. But even the European Union has more power than the Articles of Confederation laid out for our government. A lot of that is because they have a representative body, but they also have a president, and then they also can tax, and they have a lot of economic power as well. It's one of the largest economic blocks in the entire world. But each individual nation still has its own sovereignty, their own presidents. So there's not the superseding international system. It's just like a loose confederation that still is granted more power to create an economic bloc. So it's really similar to what our founding fathers first created, and the European Union has kind of taken that same sort of model, but made it a little stronger while not completely infringing on the rights of states. So why did the Confederation fall? And we've already talked about some of those issues, but there were a couple of specific issues that happened over the course of time that made people realize they really needed to make some changes. So first is the states didn't act immediately upon making this government. We put forward the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but it wasn't until February 1779 that 12 states approved the document. So they really didn't even have a federal government for almost 3 years. The central government was designed to be weak. So if you have a weak government on the onset, you're really going to run into issues later on when you need a strong government to help quell some issues that come up. Also had the one state, one vote issue that we talked about. And that meant the power of the states could operate independently from the central government, even when it wasn't in the interest of that nation. So when we talked about foreign relations, if there was an interest of one particular state that didn't match with the overall federal government, there could be ways that the state could kind of push back and push their own laws or push their own ideas. And that really became an issue when you're trying to conduct foreign policy in a war, especially. There was also a super high majority vote to get things passed. So there were 13 individual states with one vote, but that meant that you had to get 9 states to agree with you. So it wasn't 6 or 7 like you would think would be the halfway point, right? It was 9. So you had to get half the states plus 2 in order to agree with you to pass anything. It was hard to pass any substantial sort of law when all these different states disagreed on certain aspects of what they needed as a federal government. The document was also impossible to amend. So this is part of the reason why they wanted to make sure if there were changes that needed to be made, they can go back and make them. But all 13 states, if they wanted to make an amendment, needed to agree on that change. If you get 13 people in a room and you try to get them all to agree on one particular point or fact, it's almost impossible. And especially now, but even back then, it was really hard to get all 13 to agree to some sort of change. So it made it virtually impossible to change anything on the document. And there were also state rivalries too. Certain states hated each other, didn't like the way that they acted, especially southern versus northern states. A lot of states did not like each other, so how can you ever make any changes or even pass any substantial sort of law if you have states that viscerally hate each other? On top of that, like we talked about before, the central government couldn't collect taxes. So if you can't fund your own government, how are you going to rely or send money to people? It's impossible to keep an effective military or anything. So really it wore down after a point in time because it just couldn't fund itself. States also have their own money system. So can you imagine having different currency in different states? Like if you went to Nevada, you'd have to get Nevadan currency to come back and then switch your currency to come into California. It'd be a pain. And not having one central currency meant that there were different fluctuations because different states had different debt. Their value of the money was different. So all this stuff really was confusing. And how do you function in an economic system or even trade with one another if your money doesn't match up? Also, trade was vastly different between different states and different countries. If one trade agreement was for New York, that it was different for Massachusetts, it could really be a lot of issues when it comes to economic systems and functioning. A big key issue that came out of the revolution was the amount of debt that the United States had put up. We had put up a tremendous amount of debt coming out of the revolution. That huge debt was owed mostly to European countries. The entire system became an economic mess by 1787 as well. And one of the things they could not do as a federal government was pay their soldiers from the revolution. There was many times where soldiers would openly rebel against Washington and others because they felt that they earned pay, and they did. They hadn't been paid for months. They weren't receiving anything. So how do you make sure that people who have fought in the revolution were given their due money? And if you couldn't collect taxes, how are you going to pay that off? The biggest rebellion that came out of this was Shays' Rebellion, and that was basically the last straw economically for these soldiers. There were plenty of other instances where soldiers had fought or had really railed against their economic mess, but Shays' Rebellion was the most successful rebellion, actually. And it was a tax protest by Western Massachusetts farmers from 1786 to 1787, and it showed that the central government couldn't put down an internal rebellion, that there was an open rebellion against the government, and the federal government was too weak to do anything about it. And it had to rely on state militia sponsored by private Boston citizens in order to keep any sort of form of the rebellion down. With no money, the central government couldn't act to protect its perpetual union. It had nothing that it could really substantially protect itself with. It was eventually quelled, and part of that was because of Washington, because since he was a general in the revolution, or was the general in the revolution, he was able to quell the rebellion a little bit, and he had as he had done before. That the Founding Fathers looked at this government and they said, wow, we really need to make changes. And it was events like this that alarmed Washington, Madison, and Alexander Hamilton to the point where the delegates of the 5 states, they met in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to discuss changing the Articles of Confederation. That was kind of the first time they really discussed it. And the group included Madison, Hamilton, and John Dickinson, who wrote the original Confederation, and it recommended that a meeting of all 13 states be held the following May in Philadelphia. And the Confederation Congress agreed that the Constitutional Convention of 1787 effectively ended the era of the Articles of Confederation. And this is where kind of the lead up to the Constitution happens, which is the next section we're going to be talking about. So going into the Constitutional Convention, the Founding Fathers knew that there really needed to be substantial changes. And when they first came into the convention, they really thought, okay, well, maybe we'll just make some tweaks to the Articles of Confederation. We'll really see if this is possible to make these substantial changes. But the more that they read the Confederation Articles and the more that they started to talk, they realized they really needed to scrap the entire thing and start over completely. And that was a really bold move because people were not exactly sure. Again, there was a big fear of monarchy. So what is this going to look like? They didn't know, and the Founding Fathers didn't know at this point. But one of the people I want to talk about and start talking about in this video is Alexander Hamilton, who the play is based after, who people have heard of more now, and really I've gotten to know more after I've seen the play and have kind of studied him a little bit more since I'm kind of a history guy. I really wanted to learn more about him, and he's a super interesting person. But he was one of the first people, one of the most ardent defenders of the Constitution throughout his entire career, which expands in many different areas, and we're going to be talking about him over the course of the entire semester. But really, this is the first introduction of Hamilton because this is kind of where he was so important and so instrumental in making our government. So Alexander Hamilton was born in 1757, although this is up for debate. And part of that is because he was an immigrant from the West Indies, where there wasn't as well taken care of records. So there's some debate as to when he was born. But for the most part, most historians think he was born in 1757. He was an immigrant of the West Indies. So he lived on just a tiny island in the Caribbean Sea. He really was a brilliant person. People knew right away that he was really brilliant. And so there's a long history of just where he came from and who his father was and who his mother was. But the basic thing was that people on the island, after he was orphaned, saw that he was super talented and decided that they're going to send him to the United States for just how brilliant he was. He almost entered college, I think, at the age of 15 or 16, and many people at that point were also entering college really young. Aaron Burr is a good example, who we'll definitely talk about later on. But he started to gain more and more attention. He attended King's College in New York, but then the revolution started to happen, and he really felt fervently that the revolution was a good cause, that it was a righteous cause, and he dreamed of kind of this military glory, but he eventually became aide-de-camp to George Washington. Him and Washington had a very close relationship. Hamilton became eventually Washington's right-hand person. But aide-de-camp meant that he was basically his secretary. But a little bit more than that, he had more access to information, and he was kind of like a mix between a secretary but also like his right-hand person who would write drafts of certain orders and things like that. And Hamilton had a very eloquent pen, so he really wrote a lot for Washington, and Washington trusted him implicitly to write on his behalf. He was an extremely gifted orator and became Washington's linguistic arm during the Revolution. Washington really grew to trust him, and they didn't really become friends till much later on, but during the Revolution, really saw him as almost like a son. Really was an important person to Washington. Washington maybe could have given him more power, and after the Revolution, he practiced law in New York, but was consistently fighting for a new constitution. He knew even after the Revolution was done that the Articles of Confederation were a failure, and he saw how close they were. He was right next to Washington when all these things were going wrong with the army, that the government couldn't pay for their own soldiers. He saw the rebellions pick up and saw what Washington was dealing with, and he knew, and him and Washington agreed, that there needed to be a stronger government. They just didn't know how to go about that at that point. He was one of the few people who really pushed the initial government influencers to make this new constitutional convention in 1787. Hamilton really believed in a strong executive branch. It's part of the reason why people would say he's a monarchist, because they really just said, well, he just wants to bring a new monarchy to the United States. He really doesn't care about all this other stuff. He doesn't care about having a democracy. He wants a new monarchy, just not the one that we currently have. And that was a lie, really. He really was anti-monarchical, but he also was very untrusting of people and believed that a strong legislative branch would stifle government growth. And he believed that there needed to be a strong executive to kind of get things done really rapidly. And Hamilton was a really important person because he was one of the initial pushers of the Constitution, but the one who actually wrote it was James Madison. And James Madison ended up being the fourth president of the United States, but his initial contribution to the revolutionary cause was to create this really unique form of government. Madison had argued with Hamilton for a need for a new government. He really did believe that there needed to be a new, strong government in place. And he began to draft, before the beginning of the convention, an initial outline of a federal government, which became known as the Virginia Plan, and eventually what, for the most part, was accepted. His plan would outline the need for a balance between three separate branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. And this is the same balance of power that we have today. All branches would have varying degrees of power and be able to check in each branch on certain elements of their power. There was a deep mistrust in America of too powerful of a single executive. And again, this was the big issue. How do we trust that there wouldn't be a monarchy, that somebody who was in that power couldn't just put themselves as a monarchy or make themselves president for life or something like that. In effect, it was really protecting against the things that they had just left, and that was a really scary thing for people at that point. Madison's initial design in the Constitution gives very few powers to the president, but Hamilton became Washington's Treasury Secretary when Washington was eventually appointed president. Hamilton slowly began to expand the executive powers. He basically had two jobs for a long time because they were all figuring stuff out. They didn't know really the balance of power between the different branches of the government. They were all figuring it out. So Hamilton kind of picked and chose the things that it's called implied powers. And this is something we'll talk about when it comes to the Constitution. He took those implied powers that the Constitution laid out and really expanded on what that meant. Some argue that it was a huge overreach of government power, but some argue it was a very necessary overreach of government power, or we would not be the economic powerhouse we are today if Hamilton didn't have the power to do what Washington allowed him to do and what Congress allowed him to do. But these two men were really important in the lead up to the Constitution because they really did fervently believe that they needed to have not only the people at the convention believe in this form of government and a strong government, but the people needed to believe in that as well. So Hamilton was the first person to approach Madison and John Jay. John Jay would eventually become the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And so all three of these men had very influential parts in basically all three points of the government. Madison and Hamilton believed it was necessary for the United States people to be behind a stronger federal government, and they began writing and publishing what is now called the Federalist Papers in the New York Packet, which was kind of a very cheap distributed pamphlet around New York City especially, but around other places as well. And it was really distributed in order to gain support for a new constitution. They knew that they needed to start writing and convincing people of this stuff. So these three men, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, were the three authors who wrote between 1787 and 1788. They wrote 85 essays. John Jay only wrote 5 because he became sick. Madison wrote arguably the most significant portions of the Federalist Papers. He wrote 29. Hamilton wrote the other 51 in a matter of less than a year, which is crazy to think about. But the man was a genius, and he could write like nobody else, too, and he did not stop writing. So he wrote 51 compared to Madison's 29, which is pretty impressive, too. And John Jay barely did anything because he was just sick. It was a pretty incredible feat, and they wrote a lot of different important parts of the Constitution. So I'm going to have you guys read some of them this week because they really do lay out what our Constitution is founded on. Arguably the most important Federalist Papers are a couple that follow. There's about 5. First is Federalist 10, which is written by Madison. It advocates for a large republic. And again, this was the most significant document, I think, out of all the Federalist Papers because this was the overall argument for a strong federal, robust government. All of them are pretty significant, but Madison's, this one, the Federalist 10, was the most significant. Federalist 14 was written by Madison also. This was defending the Constitution itself and really put out a strong defense for why it was so necessary. And again, another really important one. Federalist 70 is the need for one strong man executive, and that was written by Hamilton. And this was arguing for the need for one person to be in charge and be the overall arbiter of the executive branch. Really didn't know what the executive branch was going to look like. The presidency then looks very different than it does now. There was a need for that one strong person and central government figure to be the face of the overall government from the executive branch. Federalist 78 was judicial review, which was, again, a Hamilton-inspired thing, and he really inspired many federal chief justices after that. When we get to the talking about the judiciary, we're going to talk about why Federalist 78 really laid out the idea that the role of the judiciary was to balance out and to check the powers of the other branches. The last important was Federalist 51, which was checks and balances written by Madison. And again, a central concept that we hold to this day, that the checks on government and balances between the government branches help our government survive many different issues that we face today. That if there's overreach from Congress, that the federal government or the judicial branch could come in and say, that's an overreach, and we believe that's an overreach. Or if the executive does the same thing, the judicial can sit there and say that too. But Congress and the president are the ones who vote in and nominate people who sit on the bench. So again, that's just a really big check on power between these three branches. And there's a lot of checks between all of them that hopefully doesn't make one or the other too powerful. But those papers really worked. They really convinced a lot of people that this was the way to go. They needed to make this change, that the Articles of Federation didn't work. And a lot of people saw that, but it convinced a lot of people as well that this was the best compromise that they can come up with. Along with the rest of the convention, the final draft of the Constitution was signed in September 1787 and fully ratified by 1789 by all 13 states. Madison is credited with writing and drafting the Constitution, while Hamilton is considered its most powerful defender. And Madison and Hamilton were close for a long time, but eventually became enemies as time went on, and we can talk about that later as well. Part of that was because of Hamilton's very strong ties to the North in New York, Madison's very strong ties as a Virginian and believing in Southern causes, and especially when it came to the idea of slavery too, which is something we can talk about. As I said before, Madison would become the 4th president of the United States, and Hamilton would become Treasury Secretary under Washington and would slowly gain power to become arguably the second most powerful person in the new government during the time. He gained so much power and had so much influence, not only to convince Washington of certain things, but to create his own powers too. It was really important the way that he laid out what his vision was for this strong federal government. So now we're actually going to go over what the Constitution says and what it lays out. And this is going to take some time. Again, really important that we talk about why this is best written constitution and form of government I think that has ever been put forward. Is it perfect? No, but it's what we have. So first is the overview. We already heard the preamble, but I'll read it again because I think it's very important to read over. Not just in song voice, although I did like the song, I probably will be singing in my head while I read it. But it says, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to protect to ourselves and our prosperity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." This really does lay out the same principles that were important from the Declaration of Independence, and it kind of lays those same things out without repeating them in just, a quote-for-quote word. But it lays out the ideas of social contract and social contract theory that were laid out by Rousseau and Locke really are reaffirmed, that this is for the people, that this government is for the people, by the people, that people are the source of law, that they are the ones who are the ultimate arbiters of this government, and it's for them. And that's really kind of amazing that this is kind of talking directly to us almost 250 years later, that we sit here and we still live by this credo that was laid out by these men who did not know where our country was going at this point and probably never thought it would get to this point. So the articles all lay out different things in the Constitution. I'll just go through them really quickly. There are ways that they're dividing power amongst the 3 branches of government in which members of the legislature, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, the executive and the judiciary are selected and responsible to different constituencies. So it made sure that certain parts of the government were directly voted by the people, and that there were certain ways that they separated the powers between these government branches, so that way they weren't getting in each other's way, and at the same time that they could always make sure that there was a way to check the others. The checks and balances concept was a concept in which 3 branches of government had oversight and control over the actions of the others, and we'll talk about why and how they did that as we lay out the Constitution. It also laid out bicameral legislature. Again, really important that there wasn't just one unicameral legislature. They believed in the 2 bicameral legislative system, and it kind of took off the model of the House of Lords and the House of Commons in Britain, and very similar sort of thing. And they even took the word Senate from the Roman word Senate and then used the House of Commons and made it the House of Representatives, which is an homage to how they viewed what they wanted in this republic. The executive branch also had a direct tie to the military, making the president chief of the military, but also making sure that the military was subservient to the people and not a byproduct or an arm of the executive branch in that way. And it's really important that those distinctions were made so that way the president could have control over the army, but the army wasn't loyal to just the president. They were loyal to the office of the president, not the person of the president. That's a really important thing that we'll talk about when we get to the executive branch. There was also an independent judicial branch, which did not answer directly to the executive. And that's a really important distinction as well, because kings had direct control of the judges. And that's a big issue for having a sort of separation of the monarchy and the executive and that power over the judicial and making sure that they are independent. There's also a portion called the full faith and credit clause, which we'll get to in a second. I'll explain that in more detail. There was also the ability to amend the Constitution, which was incredibly important. It was a lot easier to do that than just in the Confederacy. Now it had easier ways to do that, but still very difficult to actually get an amendment to the Constitution, and we'll talk about how you exactly go about that. There was also the supremacy Supremacy Clause, which was really important in terms of establishing federal power over the states, and the ratification, which was the last part, which was basically just affirmed that this was put into power at a certain point. There's also amendments, which we'll talk about next week when we talk about the Bill of Rights, and we talk about the additional amendments on top of that. There's 27 of them overall. It protects individual rights and guarantees certain protections from the federal government. This was especially important to expanding the rights to African Americans after the Civil War. Some things that it also does too, it prevents mob rule, it protects the rights of all, and it establishes really an American society. An American character is really individualistic and independent. The government was there to not only make sure that that individual was fiercely independent still, but that they would protect that independence. And it really does a great job of balancing out how we're a very individualistic society, but there was still this moral fiber that we all have that's very also communal. So Article 1 of the Constitution talks about the actual layout of the legislative branch. So it lays out a couple different things. Section 1 talks about bicameral legislation. The second one talks about what the House is. And the House has a certain type of individual that can be nominated. First, the House, they serve 2 years in the House. And that is still to this day why we have a representative who represents our small areas. It lays out the requirements for office, the selection of House leadership, taxation, and representation. In the House, they also have about 435 representatives now, but it's based after how many electoral votes that individual state has is also tied to how many representatives they have. So this was important not to have one state, one vote rules in the House, that there were more based off of the population of the entire country. If California has 56 representatives, that's better than having North Dakota, which only has one representative. I think that's North Dakota or South Dakota have 1 or 2 representatives. But the really small states only have 1 representative sometimes, or maybe 2. Rhode Island didn't have as much power as a larger state because that would be really unfair. But the Senate is much more selective, and that is laid out in Section 3. It lays out the number of terms for senators, it lays out the numbers and terms for senators so they can serve for 6 years instead of 2. And they only have 2 per state. At first, they were elected by the legislature in each state legislature, but not the actual people. That has changed now, where people are now directly voting for their representatives. Some requirements of a senator: they must be 30 years old, live in the United States for 9 years, and must live in that actual state. The vice president actually oversees they are the president of the Senate, so they oversee the business of the Senate. So when you see, if there's a major significant vote, the vice president will usually be there to oversee the entire Senate. Usually they have somebody doing it for them. It's not an everyday thing like it used to be. Big power, but not that big of power. It's more of a ceremonial role. But the vice president can also vote in any significant bill. So if it's tied 50-50, since now we have 50 states and each state has 2 representatives, we have 100 senators. The vice president, if it ends up being a 50-50 tie, the vice president is the breaking vote in that tie. So again, a significant role when they actually are needed. If you have a majority in the Senate, you better hope that if you get a close vote, that your vice president also happens to agree with you on some stuff. When the vice president can't take over anything, the president pro tempore will be there. The president pro tempore we'll talk about more when we actually talk about the leadership of the Senate and the roles in the Senate, but they have some power as well. And the Senate also has the power to do impeachment cases. Let's say the president was ever impeached, his trial would be in the actual Senate. And this has only happened a couple of times in history. In Section 4, they talk about the election of Congress. So Congress was always elected in November, and they would eventually start in December, but that was changed to January 3rd with the 20th Amendment of the Constitution, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit next week. But basically, they just pushed the date back a little bit. But now, when Congress meets, it's January 3rd. Section 5 lays out bicameral rules. There are internal elections that prevent the House from influencing the Senate. So they really wanted to make sure that there was separation between the Senate and the House in how much they influence each other in their leadership roles. So the House can't vote to put certain leadership in the Senate and vice versa. It also laid out that they were supposed to keep track of everything. That everything that came through the House was kept track of, that every bill was brought forward, that every person who spoke. It was really important then to get that on the record. Now, we have a lot of video recording. I think there's a constant, on C-SPAN, there's a constant recording of, you can see basically everything that's going on there every single day. So it's a lot easier to record what exactly is happening. That's very different than it used to be. They used to have to record everything, obviously, because there's no cameras. And so that way people could really keep track of of what was happening in the people's house. Section 6 laid out the rights of the legislatures. That meant how much the money they made. Right now, they make about $174,000. Senators make a little bit more than congressmen. It also said they cannot hold multiple offices. So if somebody was a House representative and they wanted to be the Secretary of Labor, let's say, for example, they have to quit and then eventually hopefully get nominated for that job. Section 7 lays out how bills exactly work. First, they talked a lot about taxation. Any tax bill must originate in the House. And we see this quite often happen when there are issues with budget stuff. It has to start in the House first and then make its way to the Senate, and there can be changes after that point. There's also the presentment clause. When we talk about the executive branch, we'll talk more about and go into more detail about the powers of the president. The president has to sign every bill, and he has 3 options. 1, he can pass it. 2, he can veto it, or wait 10 days and he can also pass it. The House and the Senate also have the ability to override a veto of the president. So if something is significant, it has a significant vote on it, they can bring it back to Congress and say, hey, like this originated from wherever it originated from, they can override that veto. So let's say something originated in the House, they can override that veto with 2/3 of the House, or if it started in the Senate, same sort of thing. They can override it with about 667 votes, I think. They also have a 4th option, which is a pocket veto. If Congress prevents the bill's return by adjourning for a 10-day period, the president does not sign the bill, a pocket veto occurs and the bill does not become a law. This is super complicated and something we'll get into later, but remember that as we get into it. So some of the powers that Congress has actually expressly been given. 1 is to declare war. Congress has only declared war 11 times, and I'll read off the times that they actually have declared war. And the only time that we've officially declared war, or Congress has officially declared war, is World War I, World War II, War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, and the Mexican-American War. That is it. And so that really is shocking when you really hear about that we've only declared war that many times congressionally. When you consider the Iraq War, Vietnam, Korean War, all these different intermittent wars that we've had over the course of the last couple of years has only come from Congress a couple of times. And part of that is because you can still call it a war because you're obviously fighting and getting killed or killing people. You only can declare war a certain amount of times. And it's really hard to declare war because obviously it's a very contentious issue no matter what. But yeah, you can only they've only declared war that many times. And we'll talk about more about that when we actually get into the legislative branch. I know I keep saying that, but second was also implied powers, and the implied powers gave Congress the ability to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into the execution of the foregoing power. This would become very contentious later on when trying to talk about implied or enumerated powers and what powers belong to the executive branch and what powers belong to Congress. That would be a contentious issue for many, many years. Still is a contentious issue to this day. It also laid out some things about the time and evaluation for government and society and bureaucracies, basically deciding how government should be run and what official powers bureaucracies were needed to make government run officially. Section 9 also laid out specific things Congress could not touch. One was the right to habeas corpus, which means trial by law. Congress could make no laws getting rid of that. There was also the rights of people should not be suspended unless a rebellion or invasion or martial law. So the rights of people were only to be taken away if there was a specific rebellion that threatened the actual union or the government of the United States. People were allowed to have due process as well under the law. That should never be taken away. There's also no ex post facto, which meant they cannot change a law or punishment after something's been committed. So if there's some issue that comes up, they can't then make a law and then try somebody after they've committed. So let's say, for example, that murder was completely allowed. If somebody killed somebody and then they made a law that said you can't kill anybody, they can go and try that person. Now, obviously that's ridiculous, but it really is a big issue when you're talking about, let's say if somebody was talking about like internet privacy or anything like that, somebody violated what eventually became into law, they can't go and try that person until they commit that same felony or they break that same law. They also had to have proportional taxes, meaning they couldn't overtax citizens as well. There had to be a census every 10 years. There also was a distinct portion where they had to actually make districting, and they create their own districts. So we have the census coming up actually next year, and this has been a really contentious issue because every 10 years you're supposed to have a census, which somebody comes to your house, they ask you certain questions about who lives in the house, how many people are here, and that helps actually define the population a little bit more. And if we need more electoral votes in California. They might give us 58 votes and might redistrict what sections have more people and kind of put sections in different ways. But people can also, and Congress has done a lot of stuff with gerrymandering, meaning that the Congress or the people who control the House of Representatives can really gerrymander, meaning that they can make sure certain districts that have certain voters are grouped together so that way they can guarantee themselves a seat. So like if you have very conservative voters in one area, you don't want to pair them up with a portion of near you that is also considered very liberal. Same thing when it comes to race as well. Play this really weird game of just making sure like that you can gerrymander. It's called gerrymandering, and that's going to be something we talk about when we talk about voting, about how that hurts a lot of minority voters because they're kind of marginalized in this system. There's also a no preference clause, meaning that there's equality under the law for each state. So each state had its own individual rights, that people couldn't take away those rights just because they were a certain state, that you can't favor California over Florida or anywhere else. You had to treat each state the same. You also could take no money from the Treasury without appropriation bills, meaning that you can't just take money here and there from the Treasury whenever you felt like it. You actually had to go and ask for money and get an actual spending bill to get money from the Treasury, which is basically like a permission slip. And last, there was no titles of nobility, meaning that you couldn't call someone my lord representative whatever or king whoever. And again, the fear of the monarchy really came through. They call each other, if you see Mr. Congressman or Mr. Senator or anything like that, the Mr. is really important. It's not a sir, it's not a title of nobility. There's a reason we call the president Mr. President, because that implies that that person is one of us and that they don't have a noble title, really. There's still a title of respect, but not a title of nobility. The last portion was Section 10, which was state limitations. This basically just laid out that states could not sign treaties, they can't print their own money, and they can't tax other states. This, again, kind of fixing the issues from the Articles of Confederation and saying that states had certain rights, but these were not rights that they could do. Article 2 lays out the powers of the executive branch, and this is something I'll go through really quickly because, again, this is a long video. Section 1 lays out the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years and together. There wasn't anything before this that really laid out that they couldn't serve more than 2 terms. It was kind of just a standard that Washington made, and for many years, presidents who followed that only until Franklin Delano Roosevelt did he serve 3 terms and had a 4th, but died at the beginning of his 4th term. He was the only president to do that. He shall hold his office for a term of 4 years, and together with the vice president, choose for the same term, be elected as follows. They are elected by the Electoral College. So when you vote for president, you are not voting for the actual president themselves. What you are voting for is an individual who you know for the most part. I think you can look it up. But you know who that individual is, and you know that if you vote for them, you are voting for them to go vote for that person. So you never really vote for the president directly. Again, it's not a direct democracy, it's a representative democracy. You are voting for the representative from the certain party to go vote for that person. Although it's easier just to say, who do you want to vote for? If it's Trump or for Clinton or whoever it was. So when someone votes, they're not voting directly for Hillary Clinton, they're voting for that delegate from the Electoral College who would be the representative for them. Some things it also talks about requirements for office, which we'll get into more detail when we actually talk about the executive. Secession by the vice president. Vice president still is kind of like a position that really doesn't have much power. It's kind of just sitting there waiting for the other guy to die. It has more significance now because there have been some presidents who've given vice presidents more responsibilities. Their main portion is just to be there waiting until the president dies. It also talks about their compensation. They're paid a little bit more than senators, but they're still not paid a whole lot. You'd be surprised. And then last was, it talks about the oath of office and what they have to say in order to take the oath of office, which we see whenever we get a new inauguration every 4 years. Section 2 kind of lays out the powers of the executive branch. First, they are the commander-in-chief of the Army. This does say that they are the commanders of the Army, and that's also a portion that they really got from Washington, too. Washington was the commander-in-chief of the Army, and they kind of kept that same sort of principle when he became president of the United States. It really does lay out that the Army is not subservient to the individual person, they are subservient to the office, and that is something that the military still holds in high regard to this day. Second, they have the ability to pardon, which we have seen very recently from our own president right now. He uses his pardon powers very liberally. He also can have the ability to, quote unquote, sign treaties, but really it's more of just to advise and consent to treaties. He does not have the overall power to vote on treaties. Like he can't just sign a treaty and then it becomes what it is. They can do certain things that give the president more power, but a treaty needs to be ratified by Congress, and that's a really important portion. There's only been certain treaties that have been actually ratified by Congress. He also is able to make his own appointments, so he can make an appointment to the judicial branch. They can make appointments to the Supreme Court. He can also make appointments to his own cabinet and advisors, but all of those cabinet and advisors are now under the jurisdiction. They need to at least go to Congress to have them fully appointed. Those appointments are really important to the overall executive branch power, that they are able to advise and consent to certain people serving in certain roles. And then he's also able to make a vacancy appointments to his own staff and to others as well around around government institutions that are deemed necessary by Congress. Section 3 also lays out some additional powers and some powers that the president needs to do every year. One is give a State of the Union, so he needs to address Congress at least once a year. 2, he may convene Congress. This happens every so often that a president will convene Congress for certain reasons, will tell them what's going on, will explain something. I think President Obama did it once. President Trump did it another time where he convened Congress, but because he had just gotten into the White House, so he convened Congress, and it wasn't an official State of the Union, but it was a convening of it. They can also receive ambassadors and ministers, and again, for foreign policy, this is really important. Having one central face of the government was a really important point for why the Confederation failed so hard, and this was giving that face to that government to outside nations. In Section 4, the last one really lays out that he can also be impeached, that it's totally possible to take the president out of power, and laid out how it was where it's hard to do it, but it's possible. And making sure that that person is held to accountability and not just allowed to do whatever they feel like. Article 3 now lays out the powers of the judicial branch. And so we're going to talk about this a little bit more. We are so close to being done. So Section 1 talks about the judicial power of the U.S. shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So any court that was established after the Supreme Court of the United States falls under the jurisdiction of that federal court. So as new states began to come in, there were certain federal courts in different states, in different counties, and so we have one in Sacramento here, which is a federal court, and in San Francisco they have one. So a couple of different districts is where they have these federal courthouses where they have some sort of ability to oversee an entire federal district, but they all fall under the purview of the Supreme Court. That's different from the state courts, which can also fall under certain guidelines of the Supreme Court of California, but the state courts are different from the federal courts. Section 2 talks about the jurisdiction of the courts and what power they're allowed to have. And Section 3 talks about treason and punishment for treason. The judiciary is allowed to punish as treason. An important note is the complaints of the Declaration of Independence and their order have now been addressed by Articles 1 through 3. So these are all the issues that they have with the judicial branch, but it's very vague. This was an issue for Hamilton, especially when he was talking about the Constitution. He was really worried that the judiciary wasn't strong enough, that they should be given more powers in the Constitution to lay out their own power. But it really came from the judicial branch themselves laying out their own power. It wasn't the Constitution that really gave them a lot of power. It was their own doing. And we'll talk about the Marshall Court and why John Marshall was really significant in expanding the powers of the judicial branch and making it what it is today. But the Constitution itself really is weak in explaining the judiciary, and that's because they didn't know how they wanted this to function and really created itself, not from the Constitution, weird enough. So now we get to Article 4. And Article 4 in Section 1 talks about the full faith and credit clause. And this is an important distinction. This is a really important part of the Constitution. The clause requires that all decisions, public records, and rulings from one state to be honored in all other U.S. states. That is, each U.S. court must give full faith and credit to the decisions rendered by other courts. Without full faith and credit clause, conflicts might arise between states and legal systems would be entangled in various overlapping rulings. Really, there just had to be some sort of recognition that there was decision made by one state is important to another state, and that they had to abide by the laws of that other state. If certain states could ignore the other one or ignore the rulings or the rules and laws of that one state, there could be issues that arise between the states, and there could be a lot of infighting. So the Founding Fathers felt it was really important to make sure that all public records and it were available to everybody. It didn't matter who you were. You had to have full faith and credit to the other states that were around you and respect their rights and individuality. Section 2 talks about rights and extradition. This meant that if a felon came over from one state, so let's say you go from California to Nevada and you're on the run, Nevada has to extradite you. That there are certain rights that you are given in each state as an American citizen. They're the same, but you have to abide by the rules of that state. And so imagine if you just went to California and then you could jump the fence to Nevada, then you really could just get away with anything. And let's say Nevada didn't want to extradite somebody, that could be a big issue again. So this is something the Founding Fathers felt was something to really address. Section 3 talked about adding new states, laws therein, and responsibilities of Congress to adding those new states, and how they would go about adding a new state to the Union, which was really important to expanding the entire country. Section 4 talks about the U.S. shall guarantee every state in this union a republic form of government and shall protect each against invasion on application of the legislature or the executive or against domestic violence. And this really fixed the structural deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation, and this was all done in Article 4. It was trying to make a homogenous federal government and making sure that that federal government, let's say a Virginian was in power, that a Virginian couldn't take advantage of or hate New Yorkers more. That was where the powers of the states were trying to make sure that they had individual rights and sovereignty. And it really scared a lot of states to give up that much power. But by guaranteeing that they were going to be viewed equally under the Constitution, that became part of the reason why a lot of these states agreed to join this one union. Article 5 talks about amending the Constitution, and there are a couple of different methods you can go about doing that. So there are two ways you can go about amending the Constitution. First, you can go through 2/3 of both the House and the Senate, and they must vote on the amendments, and then they can be passed, and I think the president has to sign that too. It's really hard to get an amendment done. It has to be a significant majority. It's not just a slight majority. It has to be a significant more than that in order to get an amendment passed in both houses. So in the Senate, you would only have to get 67 votes to amend the Constitution, but in the House, you have to get almost, I think it would be somewhere around I'm doing math in my head, so this is not going to be good. You would have to get about 320 votes, give or take, in order to make sure that you could get the votes passed for that too. So somebody do the math too, because I'm just too tired to do it right now. The other way you can amend the Constitution is by, on application of legislatures of 2/3 of several states. So if there are legislatures in each state that voted, if there were several states that said we want to amend the Constitution, they can call a convention and then propose the amendments and must be ratified by the legislatures of 3 to 4 states. This would be almost impossible and has never happened yet. At that time, I think they felt okay, well, there's 13 states. We can probably get, if there was something really that they needed to change and the Congress wasn't willing to do that, we could get 3/4 of the states' legislatures to pass that. That's really hard, if not impossible. Again, I'm not good at math, but you would need to get more than 75% of the vote in 50 states to get something like that done. I just don't see that ever happening. Article 5 allows for the Constitution to grow with the nation, and it can't be amended easily. It requires public consultation and representation. Thus far, 27 amendments have been added to the Constitution. So we have the first 10 with the Bill of Rights, and there's been many significant amendments we've made so far, which we'll go over next week when we talk about the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments from that. It allowed for the nation to grow. It wasn't set in stone, and that's that idea of a living, breathing Constitution that was really important to kind of alleviating the issues of the Articles of Confederation. Article 6, this is really the last big one that we have, was the acknowledgement of debts and responsibilities of the Confederation. So this was kind of saying yeah, we know we owe money from the Confederation. That's what we're going to take care of. We promise we're going to take care of it. I think that was probably from Hamilton that probably put that in. The constitutions and laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the U.S., shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, and anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Meaning that the supreme law of the land lies in the actual Congress and the government of the United States. That the supreme law of the land, there's no judge who is going to supersede that. There should be no treaties that are made without the express acknowledgement of the government of the United States, and everybody who's falls under this government purview is bound by these laws and this structure. Last is a couple of interesting notes too. One is this: they had the oath of office for Congress and what they have to say when they actually take the oath. The really interesting one was no religious test to hold office. It's kind of this implied separation of church and state, that nobody has to pass a test in order to make sure that they can be or hold an office. The last note, Article 6 affirms and enforces the idea of republicanism. States can do as they wish as long as the union is upheld and laws are supreme. States are given the right to do what they feel like. Laws of the United States are what they have to follow. If they don't, then there's going to be issues because it's going to kind of weaken the union itself. Very last and not least, at least kind of is, Article 7 is just the signing of the document, which was September 17th, 1787. It was ratified in 1789 by 2/3 of the states at that point, 9 out of the 13, and it is officially our Constitution, and it still has been for the last 250 years, with some changes here and there and some people kind of stepping on it. That was a long lecture. I am very tired. I hope you guys got something out of this, and I know I went through the last part kind of fast. Hopefully it makes sense. We're going to talk more about the actual individual roles of the Constitution in each branch of government and how they interact with one another. This is obviously probably the most important document that we have to go after so it's really important that you guys understand how it's laid out. If you don't understand this part, you're not going to understand the things that follow. So make sure that this is the week that if you really need to focus in and start studying, this is week 3. Now we're really in the thick of it. This is where you guys need to start. So that's it. I'm going to go to bed because I am exhausted from talking for almost 2 hours. It's going to be a lot shorter because I'm going to edit a lot of this out. But I'm sweating and just need to go to bed. Thank you guys for following along with this. I know this was a long one. Hopefully you guys took your time with this and really got it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm always available. Thank you guys again, and I'll see you soon.